I think the Middle East has itself changed fairly dramatically. The people of other countries have a much less positive attitude towards the United States and are very unhappy with what they've seen. Today, unfortunately, the U.S. will continue to lose its reputation while pursuing what are effectively Israel's interests rather than American interests. They never put any pressure on Israel to make any concessions at all to treat Palestinians seriously and to provide them with a political solution in a homeland. But historically, the U.S. has been interested in two different factors. One is the security and safety of Israel. The other is the security of a Middle East oil supply. The U.S. talks about stability in the Middle East, but then routinely backs policies that destabilize the same countries. Donald Trump, I think, given his support for Israel, convinced the Israelis that they could do anything that they wanted. It appears that Israel is not interested in trying to create a long-term political solution. I don't see a change in terms of Israel's policies after Gaza. My name's Doug Bondo. I am a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and I've worked as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan and been involved in policy for many years. I went to Florida State University, received a bachelor's degree in economics, then went to Stanford Law School, where I joined the political campaign of Ronald Reagan, running for president. That took me to Washington. I spent time in the Reagan White House, then moved on to the Cato Institute. And ever since, I've been involved in public policy issues. I travel, I write, I speak, and I'm very involved in international issues. Well, the situation obviously is very serious. It appears that Israel is not interested in trying to create a long-term political solution, but without some just outcome for the Palestinian people and offering them hope for the future, I'm afraid that we're just going to see more conflict in the future. I don't see a change in terms of Israel's policies after Gaza, but I think the Middle East has itself changed fairly dramatically. We see much greater reluctance of the Gulf kingdoms, starting with Saudi Arabia, to engage Israel. We've seen a rise of consciousness around the Middle East, outraged by the treatment of Palestinians and others, such as the Lebanese. These are going to make it much more difficult for Israel to try to normalize relations with other countries. And frankly, it's going to hurt America's attempt to lead the region, because the people of other countries, whatever their governments think, the people of other countries have a much less positive attitude towards the United States and are very unhappy with what they've seen. Well, there's little doubt that the U.S. has suffered very badly because of its very strong support for Israel and its lack of concern over the high number of Palestinian casualties in the Gaza war, as well as ongoing attacks elsewhere in the Middle East. And we see that loss of support not only within Arab countries and Middle Eastern countries, we see that loss of reputation in the global South around the world, while other countries view the U.S. as being hypocritical and very rather untrustworthy, frankly, in its actions. The United States, in contrast, has broader interests than Israel, and has not come to grips with the fact that its image is being harmed and that its interests are also suffering. So we're going to see what the incoming administration, President Trump, decides to do. In the past, he's been very supportive of Israel. If he does the same today, unfortunately, the U.S. will continue to lose its reputation while pursuing what are effectively Israel's interests rather than American interests. Well, unfortunately, if one looks at the first Trump administration, then President Trump really didn't pay much attention to Palestinian issues. They talked about a deal of a century that I think no one who looked at the deal thought that it would be a deal of the century for the Palestinians. They never put any pressure on Israel to make any concessions at all to treat Palestinians seriously and to provide them with a political solution in a homeland. The question then is, might Donald Trump change his policies in his incoming administration? Unfortunately, the appointments don't look very positive. His designee for UN ambassador has been very, very strong in Congress, advocating on behalf of Israel. His designated ambassador to Israel is one who takes very much a religious view of Israel as an evangelical, and simply does not seem to recognize the importance of Palestinians within that. So these are not positive steps. Now, we should recognize Donald Trump can change, and he's shown his willingness to change in the past, so that is possible. Nevertheless, I don't find many policymakers in Washington who expect a lot of difference the second term from the first term. Well, historically, the U.S. has been interested in two different factors. One is the security and safety of Israel. The other is the security of Middle East oil supplies, where the U.S. has therefore been very concerned about the Gulf kingdoms, which supply so much of the oil for the Western world. It's also been very concerned then about relationships with Israel. But of course, both of those have been changing in recent times. Israel has dominant military power, and the international oil markets have changed, including in the United States, so the Middle East matters less in terms of oil. But U.S. policy has yet to change. The U.S. talks about stability in the Middle East, but then routinely backs policies that destabilize the same countries. Well, the U.S. clearly has military domination, but it's found that leaders of other countries are going to do what they believe to be in their interests. And what they do is they try to bring the U.S. along with them. The Gulf kingdoms, for example, are happy to have the U.S. provide basically an indirect security guarantee, a willingness to go to war on their behalf. And nevertheless, the U.S. is not happy with some of their domestic policies, and frankly has not always been happy with some of their international policies. But countries, especially Saudi Arabia, feel strong enough that they can pursue their own interests, and they are doing that despite occasional criticism from Washington. Well, the U.S. acts, quite frankly, in what it perceives to be its own interest. It often will try to present its military action as being humanitarian or helpful to the region, but it's very hard to argue, for example, that the invasion of Iraq had a positive impact on anyone in the Middle East. It was a disaster for the United States. It was terrible, frankly, for the Iraqi people, given hundreds of thousands who died. And it helped destabilize the entire region. It loosed Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then ISIS on the region. So in examples like that, it's very hard to argue that the U.S. acted in the interest of the country that it was taking military action against. The U.S. has official allies and then it has informal allies. Israel is the country with which the United States is closest in the Middle East. It's not formally an ally, but it really is an ally in everything but name. Israel, frankly, is a domestic policy and a domestic issue in the United States. It's a political issue, even more than it's a foreign policy issue. So it matters most to American policymakers. Beyond that, the U.S. views itself as having strong, essentially allied relationships with the Gulf kingdoms. I mean, the U.S. has had military forces stationed in countries like Bahrain, also in Qatar and in Kuwait. The U.S. has had a strong military relationship with Saudi Arabia as well. So the U.S. would view them as being effectively allies, even though, of course, the U.S. is very much the dominant player. And for the most part, the U.S. protects those countries. What those countries do is allow the U.S. to station its military forces in them. Well, the U.S. has credibility, I suppose, with Israel because it has remained very strongly in favor of Israel, and the Biden administration has refused to apply any practical pressure on Israel to change its behavior, whether it be in Gaza, the West Bank, or Lebanon. I think the U.S. credibility elsewhere in the region has suffered. I mean, Saudi Arabia has made it very clear it does not plan on recognizing Israel without a serious movement on the issue of Palestinians. That is not what the U.S. hoped for. The U.S. was pushing to try to get an agreement where Saudi Arabia would recognize Israel. And I think we see in terms of the United Arab Emirates and other countries in the region, much greater reluctance to have as close a relationship with Israel as the U.S. had been promoting. So those countries, I think, have found U.S. credibility to be slipping. They are all working with Russia. They have relationships with China as well. So they seem to be diversifying their contacts. Frankly, they want to be careful and, have a number of positive associations, not just with the United States.
I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself, because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7.
Well, leading up to the election, it's pretty obvious that both Biden and Harris, did not want to apply pressure to Israel because they were concerned because in U.S. politics, support for Israel is very important for a number of American voters.
The images of dead children and desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety, sometimes displaced for the second, third, or fourth time. We cannot look away in the face of these tragedies. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
And despite Harris attempting to at least verbalize somewhat greater concern for Palestinians, she never suggested any change in policy, never made any serious initiative to suggest that policy in her administration would be any different. Donald Trump, I think, given his support for Israel, convinced the Israelis that they could do anything that they wanted because their hope was that he would win. And once he won, the Israeli view is that he will give them everything that they want. So policy, in the Middle East, at least with the victory of the, Donald Trump, has moved, U.S. policy more towards Israel, more anti-Iran, and less concerned about Palestinians.
Thank you very much. Wow. Well, I want to thank you all very much. This is great. These are our friends. We have thousands of friends on this incredible movement.
Well, President-elect Trump has made clear that he would like to end the Russo-Ukrainian war. He talks about doing so in a day. Very few policymakers believe that's possible. Nevertheless, he has spoken out very vigorously on the need to end what he sees as a dangerous conflict. He's very concerned about the potential for, that conflict escalating, potentially to nuclear weapons. So I believe he's going to take it very seriously. The question is, what is he going to do? He has a prior relationship with Vladimir Putin, so he's at least can have a conversation, presumably, with the Russian leadership. He's met with Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. He doesn't seem to be quite as favorably impressed with the Ukrainian government. We don't know quite where he's going. I suspect that he will be willing to cut back on U.S. support for Ukraine, probably will use that as part of his effort to convince the Ukrainians they need to negotiate. It still won't be easy, but I think there is hope that he will take the necessity of promoting peace seriously in a way that President Biden did not. Well, Americans tend not to care a lot about foreign policy. You know, the U.S. is such a dominant nation. It's so secure, it's wealthy. So Americans tend to focus on domestic policy. You know, their interest in international issues usually is limited to when, frankly, Americans are being killed and their bodies are coming back to America. Thankfully, that's not happening now. So I think you're going to see Americans will view these issues as being secondary. Certainly, they'd be happy to have the war between Russia and Ukraine over. To the extent Americans have watched it, they've grown frustrated at the amount of money that has been transferred to Ukraine. So there will be support, certainly, if President Trump decides to roll that back. On China, Americans have a negative view of China, but they don't follow the issue real closely. Donald Trump wants to launch a trade war against China. If he does that, it's going to cost Americans more, whatever they buy from China. And American farmers are going to worry about retaliation. That might get their attention. You know, in the Middle East, most Americans don't want the U.S. to go to war there ever again. Iraq was enough. Afghanistan was close by. They tired of that as well. So they don't want to go to war. But there's a certain number of Americans who are very passionate in their support for Israel. Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans have grown much more vocal in their support for Palestinians and insisting that U.S. policy be more even-handed. So there may be some political ramifications of that one, where we see Americans on both sides, taking this argument to Washington and to the administration. Well, one solid vote-getter in American elections, in the past at least, has been support for Israel, especially on the Republican side. So Donald Trump ran very hard on that, frankly, but so did Kamala Harris. I mean, she was very careful what she said. She tried to present to Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, that she cared about what was going on in Gaza. Nevertheless, she never advocated any difference in policy with that of the Biden administration. And of course, President Biden, refused to apply any pressure as well. So in that case, both campaigns were really aimed at getting the support of those who favored Israel. But I think upcoming, we're going to see a much greater fight in the Democratic Party over this issue, where an awful lot of younger progressives care passionately about Palestinians. And I think the Democratic Party, at least, less so Republicans. But Democrats are going to be discussing this internally, and we might see a change for the next election. President-elect Trump had a relationship with Xi Jinping during his first administration. It started off rather positive, but then it deteriorated. He launched a trade war against China, and then by the end of his administration was blaming China for the COVID, pandemic. He's appointed, or not, he says he's going to nominate anyway, several China hawks to his administration. That would suggest he's going to get tougher on China. Nevertheless, Trump has long been most interested in economic issues and interested in reaching a deal. So there is at least a possibility that what we're going to see is a tough negotiation, but nevertheless a negotiation where Trump will try to settle some of these issues and perhaps in the end will be more willing to negotiate with China than the Biden administration was.